Welcome to Off the Grid, a podcast for small business owners who want to leave social media without losing all their clients.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go off the grid. Okay. I know that you really want to put your phone away. Yeah. Let's go off the grid.
Hello, and welcome back to Off the Grid, your favorite artist's favorite not art podcast, their favorite business podcast, favorite marketing podcast, maybe. At least that's what my artist friends tell me we are. We're your artist friends' favorite business podcast. Yeah, I think I got it. I'm Amelia Ruby. I am the founder of Softer Sounds Podcast Studio and the host of this show, where I talk to creative people about how they share their work online without relying on social media. We are currently in season 6 of the podcast, and this season, I feel like we are digging deep. We are really excavating all the ways that social media impacts our businesses, our relationships, our careers, and even our identity and our personhood itself. It's been a pretty philosophical season so far, if I may say so myself as a person with a PhD in philosophy. And I hope you're enjoying that because today's episode is going to get even more philosophical as we talk about the trance of dopamine loops on social media, about how our agency is eroded when we spend too much time with algorithms, and perhaps how we can use social media and also not use social media to deepen our relationships and communities. Before I tell you who we're talking to explore all of that, I do want to remind you that the free Leaving Social Media Toolkit is here for you. This is a totally free resource that I created to help you step back or away from social media. It includes 3 free resources, my 5-step plan for leaving any social platform, a list of 100 ways to share your work and life without social media, and a creative marketing experiments database to help you collect and plan different marketing strategies or tactics that you might implement to move your work away from social media. Again, all of that is free at offthegrid.fun/toolkit. And I even spruced it up a little this year. There's a new welcome video. There's some fancy new Notion formatting. So you can find that at offthegrid.fun/toolkit. And if you enjoy the show, I really hope you'll check it out. Okay, all of that shared, let me tell you about today's guest so we can dive right into this conversation. Elise Granata helps people build community with each other. She's currently organizing with the Bradley Street Bicycle Co-op and designing experiences and community strategy inside IDEO's Play Lab. Before that, she connected people at an internationally beloved participatory museum, a voter registration org that activates diehard fans at festivals and concerts, and through experiences she's designed herself, like an amateur dance class or secret midnight concerts. Elise also writes about community craft in her amazing newsletter Group Hug, which we definitely talk about in this episode. Elise and I are new and fast friends, and I'm thrilled to have her on the show today to talk about escaping the social media trance and bringing more texture to our communities and our experience of the world. Let's dive right in. Hi, Elise. Welcome to Off the Grid.
I'm so excited to be here.
Yay! I am so excited to have you. You write one of my all-time favorite Substack newsletters. And I subscribe to a lot of them, but there are probably 5 that I read religiously, and yours, Group Hug, is one of them. So I'm so thrilled to have you on to talk about all of that and more.
Thank you so much, Amelia. I think it was one of those classic things where I'm a big fan of you and Off the Grid, and then was like, oh my God, Amelia subscribes to Group Hug. And I was like, and I love and appreciate the way that you really break down so much that is really flattened, often in the discourse, and into its kind of squishy, nuanced parts, that just feels really important. And I feel like we're kind of in the same little category with that. So glad to be here.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I often start these sorts of conversational episodes by asking folks about their background with social media. And when I was prepping for this, I realized that because I met you on Substack, I don't actually know if you've really ever been active on social media, which is really fun because most of the people I have a conversation like this with, I used to follow them on Instagram. I knew their social media presence, and then I left, and now they've circled back. But for us, I guess Substack is our social media IDK. But I still want to start with this question. So I'm so curious what your relationship with social media was like or has been like. Like, how did you get on the platforms? Are you active on any right now? What's that look like for you?
I always think about this, like, since being off social media, when I have a friend and then I feel the impulse to look at their presence online to fill out my understanding of them. And it is, like, obviously so much more important to just trust your actual experienced understanding of them.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm glad to be in that, like, virginal space with you. But yeah, it was, like, fun to think about this. Like, I think I started using social media kind of classically, like, was on all of the MySpaces. I really loved using social media, like, as a creative tool. So I was really big into Zanga and Tumblr. So I was, like, more maybe on that side of the niche. And then I think now when I really think about social media and my experience with it, I think back to how I really used it as a tool for access to community. Like, I grew up going to shows and DIY spaces and arts collectives and, like, weird, freaky things like that. And, like, Facebook was such a center for events. Like, I just remember both, like, attending shows, finding out about them there, organizing my own shows, and that rush when you'd post a really good, like, lineup for a show, and then you'd see, like, RSVPs roll in at, like, a higher rate than normal. Like, and then even, like, it also created this entire experience where after the show was done, people would post pictures from it, and then you'd look for, like, pictures of yourself and your friends, or, like, there was even a local message board to Connecticut, which is humiliating to talk about, which was called CT Ska, that I loved, and it was kind of like it was
Hell yeah.
way more than just ska.
It's fine. This is a ska safe space.
It's not, it shouldn't be. But yeah, it was also a place, like, when I was like, oh yeah, that was, like, pre-Reddit, like, a place that I would meet people online and then meet them in person at shows. And it was, like, a very localized message board network. And yeah, and then I also think about, like, around that time when I was really involved in DIY shows, like, I was also writing, like, one of my first zines that was just an excuse to basically interview my friends and bands and artists who I cared about. And it was funny to think about how I would use social media as, like, a way to promote the zine. Like, I don't know if you, like, think about early days like that too, where because no platform was, like, amazing at doing, like, all-in-one services, you kind of had to cobble together different things, which I loved to do. But I had this, like, print zine. I remember I would upload it to that app Issue where you could, like, flip through it. It would make, like, a like page sound as you, like, turn. And then
Yeah.
I'd, like, post it on Facebook and, like, tag the bands, which is, like, so funny to just think about as, like, a main distribution mechanism. But yeah, I just remember, like, those things and how eventually then I had a blog called Grastronaut, which was a space where I was writing about DIY art spaces and, like, the models and governance that they use to survive. And even then, similarly, it was just on a Blogger. I don't even think it went out to an email list of anything. I would, like, get it and then have to kind of distribute it out into the world. So I really feel like my orientation towards social media was as, like, an amplification platform and a way to kind of find out about, like, weird arts events and shows.
I can relate to that so much for many reasons that have come up on this podcast and also many that haven't. I was also very much a Tumblr teen. I was obsessed. I spent a lot of time, like, curating my own self-image through my microblog that still exists, but I will never cop to the URL of ever in a million years. And then I also used Facebook so much for event organization and gathering RSVPs and getting the word out and that type of amplification. I mean, I think a lot of people still use Facebook in that way. And it is very popular for community events and for finding things happening locally, even if we don't think of Facebook as such a localized hub anymore. But that is how it started, because it started at this sort of university or school-based model. It was all about the local and hyperlocal. And then it became about the global. And I think that's a shift I don't talk about or think about as much with these platforms. I also love how you're focusing on, like, social media as an amplification tool, because it's interesting. Like, that is also very common advice now. A lot of the advice I see around for people who are staying on social media is create your work on channels you own, but then share it out through social media. And I think that there is merit to that. And there are also challenges with that we'll get into. But even if I look back at my own journey, like the first content creation that I started on Instagram was originally I would make blog posts on a website I had and I'd share them on Instagram. And then Instagram became so all encompassing that the blog dropped out and I stopped using the blog entirely. I just went only to Instagram. It became the only place I was creating and sharing. And then I built a blog back in because I was tired of being on Instagram and then I exited entirely. So it's interesting to see how these like strategies flow and can work together or also just kind of circle back around. And similarly with like the all-in-oneness, I'm seeing a lot of people right now complain that they don't want to leave a platform like Instagram or Facebook because they need like 6 other platforms to replicate all of the services that they're getting on Facebook. And I do understand that. I myself might complain about it if I was actively using Facebook for a lot of things. And at the same time, I'm trying to embrace that multiplicity over a sort of unified, one size fits all, one source does all type of platform that is not decentralized. Just so much of what you're saying really resonated for me. And I think is even in it being the past of your social media experience, it feels very present in how people are relating to or advising other folks to relate to social media.
Yeah, and that's such a great point too about the like 6 platforms that could do one. And I feel like maybe it's less about decentralization and more about like what these platforms actually exist for us to do, right? Because when you look at these kind of vestigial things that are still popular about Facebook, i.e., events or marketplace, like it's because they're like a means to an end. Like they're a means for maybe in-person connection or like gathering in some form and versus just the end being like more time on platform. Like, and yeah, and even just thinking about how different platforms like discourage the actual amplification, like how there's, for example, like, not that I'm using LinkedIn as social media, but like it doesn't like LinkedIn won't unfurl previews to different articles that you're posting that maybe are not using the LinkedIn feature. So they like start to make you go inward into their platform for this all-in-one thing. And I think to your point too, we have to be asking like what is the end that this is actually serving? Am I like on a path walking towards something, thinking that it's going to bring me towards other people, but really at the end of the path, it actually loops back around and just starts me on that path again, which I know we've spent some time talking about already too.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that really I have been writing about a lot in the chapter of the book I'm writing on algorithms, which is this idea that algorithms are designed to solve a problem, but they will take whatever information you put into them and run it through the algorithm and give you something out. Even if that's something that comes out does not at all solve the problem. If you like feed it bad information, it will give you a bad answer. This is called like garbage in, garbage out, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And I think about this a lot when it comes to our use of these different algorithmic tools. And I think that the spaces that you're pointing to, like events or marketplace, or I use the example of a tool like any of the mapping apps, like we go to them with a problem and the algorithm actually solves that problem, as opposed to what we want out of it being this sort of weird byproduct or like sidewalk sort of view of our, like, as we're on this path to what the company that owns the algorithm wants, right? So if they just want us to spend more time on the app, you're right, we're just like walking in this loop of a track. And we think we're walking toward community and connection, but really that's just because they like put a random bleacher on the sideline. That's not actually what's happening. But it can be really hard to sort that out as these platforms have become more complex. The algorithms are very opaque. They're all proprietary, right? It's not like we can see what's happening or shift our desires there. So I think this is all really fascinating. And I want to go back to your story. So if those were all the ways you were using social media, what shifted for you and how do you use it now, if at all?
Yeah, I really started to, I think in the end, I was using Instagram most frequently 2021. And I think both because of the pandemic, and then I had also just moved back to where I grew up in Connecticut from where I was living in California for most of my 20s. And it just felt like I can't really remember what actually made me start to want to get off. I think I just felt my brain not quite feeling like mine. I felt myself doing the classic, like, more comparison, more feelings of FOMO. I think that was actually very deep for me at the time, now that I'm talking about it, because I had just moved back home, was like temporarily living with my parents. And it was like really like painful for me to see people like living their full lives, even if their lives were mainly inside their house because of quarantine. But it was still difficult for me to see people with like more independence or like living better lives that they had already kind of set up. I felt like I was starting back at scratch, moving back home. And so I got off at that time and just tried to give myself like more of a time to wean off. And within, I wasn't like perfect, but I think within a few years I really stopped reaching for it as much. And in that time, I think at the time I had started like a very small personal newsletter that was just about creative arts, random philosophy musings, that was really just to like distant friends and family and like a way to kind of continue connecting to folks. But I really began to not miss it as much. Like, I think that being here and maybe having the benefit of starting over like geographically a little bit, and also back to a place where I had some base of like family and like some friends that I had known for a long time. It wasn't like I was coming back to like a super thriving friend group, but there were like one or two people or three people who I like was very close with and had a lot of history with. And so I think that in that time, that was kind of when I started to really lean off of that. And it's been interesting with the newsletter because I think that has been one of my first forays back into something that's a little bit more visible and connected. And I definitely feel the same like lottery things going off in my brain every time that a post is like more popular or I see some subscribers join. Like, I definitely notice similar behaviors coming back to me. But I think for me, having this like more ownership over something that I'm actually like creating and writing and putting a lot of thought and effort into just feels really different substantially than it did on social media, where I was like more curatorial in my life. And this one feels genuinely like I'm exploring ideas that are new and interesting to me. And yeah, I think I feel more ownership and like less gnarliness in that.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I think the marketer in me is just hearing kind of two distinctions that you're making. One, perhaps between like a more curatorial impulse versus a more like generative creative impulse, where more of your time on Substack is focused on writing, creating, putting things out than it is on perhaps like following the right accounts, looking at the right things, engaging in the right ways, pleasing the algorithm, etc. And simultaneously, the distinction between like an owned channel and a not owned channel, a platform channel. So on Substack, you have direct contact with your subscribers because you have their email addresses. And on social media, we all know that you don't. If you leave Instagram or if TikTok does go away, you have no access to contact those people again if that platform is not there to mediate that interaction. So I appreciate both of those distinctions. I'm curious, did you ever like leave social media? Like, did you have like an exit or did you just like one day log off and stop posting and that was it? Or are you still on it? Actually, I guess I really don't really know. Do you still use it?
I don't still use it. I use it like a browser where I still have my account. I recently, like as of a few weeks ago, changed my bio to just say not active anymore because I get a lot of follower requests that I just don't do anything with new people who I've met in my life in the last 4 years, who I'm like, I don't even want to give you access to seeing the archive because it's just not relevant to your understanding of me. But I would say that I use it still to really connect with maybe like businesses or like different accounts or thinkers who otherwise maybe aren't posting as frequently. Definitely during moments like the LA fires, I was on there a lot, just kind of looking at people like my friends who are based there. So I find myself kind of using it as like once in a while when needed for like, I still definitely crave that sense of like what's going on and like what are people's experiences like. But I find myself going to specific accounts of other people in my life or people who I know will have perspectives on this versus just like I'm not scrolling and I'm not really doing that on my phone. So that's kind of where it's like in my life right now. And I didn't do any kind of announcement. I'll often like talk to friends, be like, who know that I'm off, and I'll be like, it'll just be a weekend where I happen to see something that they posted. I'm like, I'm not on it anymore, but I did see that you posted this thing. I'm like, I'm not on it, not on it. And but I'm like, damn, they think I'm definitely more on it than I am. And so it's always this dance of like feeling like you want to correct, but classically, like, I feel like I text people way more. I'm like having phone calls way more often. I'm like reaching out directly to have like longer video chats with people. And those are kind of replacing the passive constant interaction that was always happening for me on Instagram.
Yeah, that makes so much sense to me. And I definitely also know that type of like social cueing, because if people expect you to be on the app, they'll expect you to be up to date with their lives. They'll expect you to know things that they've posted. And there's a sort of signaling of like, you can't expect that of me. I am not doing that. And I'm happy to be in communication and community and conversation with you in these other ways, but it's not going to happen through this broadcast channel. But I also really understand like the value of a broadcast channel like that, especially during horrific events like the LA fires, where nobody has time to text every single one of their friends to be like, here's what's happening, right? It's nice to have a space where you can be like, this is where I'm sharing updates on my Instagram page, on my X account, or what might it be. And even personally, I can remember a year ago, there were multiple very devastating tornadoes where I live, and I happened to be out of town, and I had friends staying at my house with my dog, and I was really trying to figure out what was happening. And I got on Twitter, which I don't even have a Twitter account, and Twitter makes it impossible to look at Twitter if you don't have an account. But I was like trying to find information anywhere I could that was like of the moment, immediate updates about where the tornadoes were, so I could map how close they were to my family's homes, which was very close in some instances. And I think about that. And then I think about the AI generated imagery of the fires on Twitter or X this year. And I just feel like horrified and depressed. It does feel like this sort of social utility, like social media did take on these social utilities, these like clear things that were really important for public safety and beyond in some instances. And even those functions, I think, have really or are really eroding in real time. And we're seeing that happen.
Yeah. And I mean, again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, like none of these impulses are like bad, right? I know that, again, I'm speaking maybe that to myself too, because I can feel guilty when I'm really deeply on it in a time of emergency or trying to understand. But I think that impulse to sense like what other people are really feeling is often always a response to maybe like lack of media coverage, period, lack of media coverage from the perspectives and kinds of people that you're interested in understanding their experiences. Like there's a lot of, as you said, social utility and being able to tap back into what people are like from this kind of grassroots sense are actually feeling. So I get sad for us right now that like in these moments, particularly of like emergency or just trying to grok, like, how's everyone doing? And like, what are we going to do based on this feeling that we don't have better options? But again, the impulse itself is actually, I think, a signal that we need something that is maybe offering that, which I think a lot of folks turn to Reddit as well. That was another space that I was kind of looking at, but all of these, that's like a little bit more mediated and like a little bit more moderated depending on where you were at. But like, again, these impulses might be okay to want to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. I do my best not to moralize about social media use here while also presenting some very strong arguments for why we might perhaps want to limit or stop using social media, which I guess is where we're headed next, honestly. So maybe we'll just head that direction. You and I had a wonderful and long email exchange that sort of became this podcast episode. And in my notes, it just says in all caps, escape the social media trance, remember your agency. So as vague as those notes are, I'd like to take us in that direction. I'm curious if we can kind of unpack this idea of a social media trance, which is language I think you had first sent me. And so I would love to hear, just personally to start, like, what does that mean to you? How did your experience of social media perhaps make you feel like you were in a trance? Or what are some like broader cultural trends you've seen around how social media impacts our agency?
Yeah, I think about this question a lot. When I think about the word trance, I don't do this often, but I did look up the definition just to be
Great. I
like,
love it.
where are we kind of orienting ourselves within this word? And it does kind of mean it's not like a total immersion in unconsciousness. There's a bit, it's like a sleep-like state. So there's a bit of what they call suspended animation, which is something that I relate to deeply in the definition when I think about my relationship to the internet and social media. I think back to maybe 2013 when like Black Lives Matter became more prevalent like on social media and really understanding for me like that was one of the like first times in my 20s where I was really like understanding new political frameworks and urgency and experiences and pain. And I remember feeling like the classic thing that has now repeated across many different atrocities and climate catastrophes and disasters and political violence, which is this like cycle of actually feeling this like immense pain and understanding that something needs to happen and I need to be part of something that is happening, but having no idea like how to really materially contribute to that action. Of course, like more of the activist opportunity is the thing that gets leveraged. So like showing up to protests or actions. And it's been really interesting in the last few years seeing how organizing is becoming something kind of prioritized or put not above activism, but like people are trying to understand what that even means a little bit more. Or people who have like been going to protests for years and feeling burnt out on that action and feeling like it's not really making a difference, or that like more legislatively targeted action is not really feeling motivating or sustaining or again impactful. And yeah, so I think I've been just navigating that experience online in the last like 10 years. And I just think about like, I feel like, again, we're talking on like two scales, right? One is like actually organizing in response to some emergency or around something that you're wanting to change. I also just think about the much more like mundane, everyday scale of people feeling really lonely and wanting any sort of community and other people in their life every day. And I think that these both deserve to be in the same circus tent because I don't think they're separate. I think it's all about connection, and often it can be, it's not always about necessarily like in-person connection, but it can be about like connecting with other people in some way that is like real and offline, or maybe not using social media as like the primary medium for how you're doing that. And so back to like the trance, I think like I notice in myself this, like I always think about this gap where we can understand the importance of something and be totally on board for its meaning, but really lack the skills or motivation or understanding on how to get started to actually bridge that gap and make some sort of an impact. And so you and I were emailing about this and I kept coming back to this like idea of agency and like what gives us agency? Like what gives us that literal feeling of being able to unplug and like start something with other people, whether that's like walking out your door and like volunteering at an organization or like messaging some friends and trying to like organize a giving circle towards something. Like there's less of a bias towards action that I think can keep us in this kind of consumptive state while constantly feeling bad for not really doing more. And so that's when I'm thinking about trance, like I know you and I were really talking about that state of like that somnambulance kind of feeling where you, yeah, again, I get hooked on this is like, you know, it's important, but you like don't know what to do. And I'm like, what's in the middle? Is it that we don't know how? Is it that we are not able to tap into power that we maybe have once had or and forgotten or have never experienced, so we don't know how to do it? Like, is it that our networks are so decayed at this point that we don't even know where to begin? So that's something, yeah, I'm thinking about a lot that I think social media specifically keeps us in a pretty deep trance around.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with my experiences on social media. And I think the other thing that's coming up for me is sort of like a loop with social media where it's like it provides something for us to be outraged about. And then it like exacerbates that feeling to the point where we like feel like we have to just numb out from it. And social media also provides the numbing. And then we just circle around that loop over and over and over again. And I feel like within that loop, there's just nothing off the app. That all of that loop happens on the same app. And action is something I think that pops us out of the feed. Even if we stay on our phones, it requires us to close the social media app and make a phone call or send an email to a legislator or a grassroots organization. And I think that part of the trance is happening for us, perhaps like on that more like neurological level of these like dopamine cycles that we go through. It's happening on an emotional, spiritual level, which we can also consider trance within. That's what may be happening like inside of us. But it's a very like targeted, strategic effort that actually social media companies have put millions of dollars into to figure out how to orchestrate this behavior. So for me, there are always two levels. It's like, how can I recognize what's happening when I'm on social media? How can I not blame myself for that? Because I do see that it has all been set up this way. Like I, to some extent, a victim of the cycles that these companies have put into place. And also then, how do I empower myself to remember that I'm not simply a victim of social media? I actually do have agency. I do have power. I can change my behavior. I can close the app. I can step away from my phone. I can do something else. Like I actually have that power to escape the trance, even though I feel like I've been hypnotized in this space. It's like that, both and. It's like recognizing the power over me and recognizing my power within to interrupt that cycle.
Yeah, and I think as you're saying, naming it, there's so many different angles to attack it from. Like sometimes, yeah, I find it very motivating to remember like who's behind this and that this is exactly what they're after, like my dissociation and sense of powerlessness. Like that makes me angry. And it's one thing that can inspire me to get off social media. And I think it's also about what you are running towards, which happens maybe a little bit in that gap. You need to be tending something new to be going towards that and not feeling like you're just leaving everything that is connecting you to the world behind. And I think it can also be really helpful to feel like maybe you're incrementally doing both at the same time around that. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot about how one of my earlier thoughts around this was just we are what we spend time doing. And so often if this is about scrolling and shopping, like I've recently been looking at how optimized communities have actually, like we have this kind of, there's like a two-way effect between our expectations and comfort levels and how this is actually also shaping like what's available in like community spaces and organizing spaces, which is that I wrote this piece on like the optimization of community and how it's kind of freaky when you look at a lot of these like newer, like whether it's like the run clubs or the swim clubs or just like dinner party templates, like, and you go on these websites and they're like so beautiful and they have like wildly active Instagram presence and they have like podcasts and like entire like whole content farms underneath this community that might just be meeting in like New York or might just be meeting in some random town somewhere. But I remember like looking at these and kind of feeling this like gratitude that they exist because it's important for anything social and supportive to be happening. And this kind of ick when I would look at them to be like, why is this so polished? Like it kind of signifies all of these other things, like not just like the resources and time it takes to do that, but also on our end that like I found myself trusting them more and actually reaching for them more. And when I moved back to New Haven in Connecticut, feeling again this kind of weird FOMO at being like, there's like some stuff happening here, but their Instagram presence like hasn't been updated in like 10 weeks. Like, are they even here? Like this community fridge? Are they active? Oh, this parks group. They don't have like a newsletter. Do they meet? What am I going to do? Just show up in the park and like walk into the woods and hope that I like meet a person? Like, and there's like real downsides to the opposite of this. Like, I think again, it comes from like our craving for information, which could be important both from like literal physical accessibility in these spaces and also just knowing that like the people who are going to be there are your kind of people and that you're going to feel safe and like loved. But I definitely also just think about how it's almost this like we are kind of carving away the like going back to paths that we're like carving away the path we wish existed as we keep like looping around too. We're kind of like changing the forest around us or something, woods metaphors. And how, just to your earlier point, like, yes, it's about knowing the larger architecture that's keeping us on these apps. And it's also about looking at our own expectations of what we consider worthy of engaging with off the apps and maybe lowering our expectations a little bit or coming to love. And maybe if that can't be information for you, like if it is extremely important to understand exactly what the agenda for a meeting that you're going to is going to look like and knowing like exactly who's going to be there and seeing evidence of what it looked like in the past, like that's great. That's important. But I've also like, for example, even for myself, started to just change my aesthetic standards for things a little bit. And I actually have a folder of like my favorite kind of like ugly emails that get sent from community organizations who I love. Like there's like a land trust locally who just sends, it's not ugly, it's a wonderful email, but it's just like an update about like a bee that's on their, and I'm like, this is so good. I want to learn more about this bee. They put a QR code on a bee. It was crazy. But yeah, so I just also think about that expectation level. And again, like one hand washes the other. Our expectations are changed as we spend more time on there. Then we start to change the landscape because of this flattening and homogenization of our expectations of the world outside.
Yeah, I think this is so, so important. I love what you're pointing to with like how our aesthetic expectations shift because so often, like the aesthetic norms are shaped at a level we don't necessarily see happening. And so it's not until you really slow down to be like, wait, why do I expect all my clothes to be beige? That you realize that like your norms were shifted because beige was what was popular on Instagram. It became what was available in the stores. And all of a sudden, everything you own is beige. And then you have to have that disruptive moment. And as somebody who wrote a whole dissertation on aesthetics and philosophy, like the disruption is the whole point. That's actually like what's interesting to me in aesthetics, but that has all gotten kind of covered up by the sort of appeal of the harmonic ideal of beauty, which is not what the early aesthetic philosophers were going for. They were like, beauty's amazing and wonderful. And also the whole point of it is not to like lull us into submission. It's actually to like wake us up from the mundanity of everyday life. And I think that these like algorithmic aesthetics just do all of that, like lulling us into submission. I think there's a difference between an aesthetic that is created and enforced by an algorithm versus one that is cultivated by a community. I also think aesthetics, we think that like taste is personal, but it's not inherently personal. It's always impacted by our societal location, by our class, by our race, by our gender, by all of these things. And what's coming up for me as you talk about all of this, just to go back to your very practical examples, is that my friend Grace and I used to always say that like we didn't want to work with a spiritual practitioner that had a pretty website because they weren't doing like the real work. Like if they were doing the branding, they were like not on the level that we were trying to get to with them. And I think that what you're describing is also just like farther down the road from like when we first had the earliest influencers on Instagram. It's like all of a sudden everybody had to be a photographer. Like whatever you do that made you cool, you also had to be a professional photographer so it would look cool on the internet. And I think that that's why we expect these like tiny community organizations run by 3 people with a dream to have the most beautifully designed emails like they are a tech company that has 1,000 employees. It's just that those aesthetic expectations start to become the foundation for everything we're looking at. And I think we struggle to differentiate between them. Like once we connect a certain aesthetic with a certain level of value, it can be hard to say like, wait, actually, this can be super valuable without an aesthetic.
I kind of like to break these down, like by first, like maybe even thinking about your own experience, right? Which is like, oh, did I go to this thing that kind of marketed itself as being the like coolest gathering of something of like creatives or whatever and felt this like hollowness afterwards? Why? And then like almost looking back at like what made me want to go to that in the first place? Was it because there was something materially like interesting and compelling about this? Or was I lured in by aesthetics, other people saying it was cool, the like messaging and like language that they used? So I think that it can be a good way to kind of break down, like, or was it because they had, a very active presence, like really good emails, and it made me think that they were thus like a place I should spend my time? And it's actually been really interesting because I organized with a bike co-op here in New Haven. And when I first got involved, I was kind of coming from working at this museum in Santa Cruz, California, that had inherited a lot of Bay Area, like Silicon Valley mentality into our like little scrappy community organization. And when I first got to the bike co-op, I was like a big proponent of, let's make our emails look a lot better. Let's make our website make sense. Our website is still out of date and like doesn't make a lot of sense. And it does kill me a little bit inside all the time because it's not clear from an informational perspective. But I also had like dear friends and fellow volunteers push back in a really beautiful way to say like, yes, and part of this is like the human experience part, like that there's like clear enough information and people will come here or like learn more about what we do online and maybe reach out to somebody else and like learn something through another person. And maybe not everything has to be communicated perfectly through our online presence.
I think that this is really important because I feel like a lot of the perfect social media presences and beautiful websites and the need for everything to have a whole content farm behind it, what it can do is mean that we only ever engage with the online aspects of something and we don't actually step into the physical experience, the IRL experience, or even just the shared experience, right? Maybe it always stays at the online level, but we move from, oh, I follow your Instagram account to, oh, I actually went to your virtual book club and I talked to somebody. And I think that, I think about this a lot in the realm of reading, where because I have a bookish podcast now and I read 150 books last year. I'm like really into books right now. It's like what I've become. But there's so many conversations around how reading has become more about performing reading, buying the merch around reading, owning the books. And it's not actually at all about reading the words on the page or engaging with the author's ideas or in conversation with other people reading those books. And sometimes I can fall into that myself. As we record this, I'm wearing a sweatshirt that is merch for a book I have not read. So
Thank you for that confession.
But I know the author of that book. I have read one of her other books. She's like an indie author in a online book club that I am in on Discord, and we all cheer her on. So like it is both performative and personal. Like it has these different layers. This is somebody I've sent emails to. Like we know each other in a sort of internet kind of way, and I wanted to support her work, so I bought a sweatshirt. But I think that in these conversations around, I guess, like book talk, which is people reading on TikTok specifically, this comes up a lot. Like, are you just performing it or are you actually doing it? And I think that there are a lot of layers to that. A lot of that discourse is rightfully critiqued as pretty ableist and problematic. Like, people will get into the nuance of like, are audiobooks reading? Yes, they're reading. Do we have to differentiate between skimming and reading? Like, is there one true way to read? Like, I don't find all of that interesting or useful. I'm not here to police how people read or what they do. But I am intrigued by this sort of trend of like, can I become a reader simply by buying merch about books? And where does my like consumption and performance of something take over any actual experience with it, whether that be virtual or physical? And I think aesthetics is like what's at stake in all of that.
Yeah, I mean, just what you're saying about the performance piece of it, it begins, as you're saying, to take precedence over the actual experience of doing the thing. And I think it's very alienating. It's extremely alienating for all of us. Like not just being alienated from the activity itself, whether that is like reading or being in community with other people, but also like the experience of, again, that going back to agency, like the creative experience. Like I think one of the dangers when we like look at flattening of like aesthetics is that there's also like the bar becomes higher for doing something yourself because you have to meet like this perceived level of what is necessary in order to start something, that you can't just start a book club, but you need to be ready to have like a very maintained Instagram brand and newsletter. And, and I've honestly talked to people who are like, I can't do that, so I shouldn't do this. And like, I shouldn't host this like dinner party if I can't do it forever. and have a theme and like have a really good discussion question. Like we've begun to like put up these weird barriers in front of doing something that should be pretty basic for all of us and more accessible for us to begin with, which is why I'm always inspired by the artists and like DIY people and like radical people and like freaks in my life, and where I feel like I have some freak privilege because I've been like my whole life a little bit more able to just do something that I had an idea for, like having a random idea for like a walking tour scavenger hunt and like putting it on, and like having an idea for just like recently we did this co-working event through Group Hug where people just got together and submitted volunteer forms or came up with ideas for events they wanted to host in their community that was like about co-working to start your next community thing. And it was really like quick for me to be able to just like have an idea and execute on it. And I just think about how, again, we've been really alienated from that experience and trapped into a pretty like, and not that everybody has to start their own thing in order to be accessing community, but I think we've been like pretty alienated from that sense of what it does mean to participate, what it looks like when that's passive versus more active. And like, look, a lot of fandom and any kind of like affinity community does maybe just look like all kind of wearing the same stuff and liking the same things. And that's like perfect. And that is your level of like participation in community. But I do think, again, if you're finding yourself like a part of one of those communities and you're feeling like a hollowness or you're missing like some deeper, maybe more intimate connection, or whether that is to like the thing you're gathering around or like to other people, like maybe this is why, like I think early on in Group Hug, I did some like analysis around like balance and community. And I like was looking at run clubs as an example of this, where some folks have like just shared that their experiences, they're actually very like shallow when it comes to in-person connection. It's kind of more about the like circus of the thing and the aesthetics of it and the like sceniness of it. But when it came to actually building like deeper relationships, which they kind of went in search of, it wasn't really happening. And so again, I think it's really about like, what is your personal experience? Like, yeah, it's what's your personal experience deep in book world? And like, is this fine for you? Like, are you actually enjoying like the sweatshirts and the like sharing of it? Or is it feeling like a little like hollow? And that's kind of where it can be a good place to start looking deeper.
A couple things are coming up for me. One is that I am always thinking about like the different types and textures of community in my life. Like sometimes I talk about community in the singular, but we're all part of many, many, many communities. And so it's fine for me to have a relatively like shallow sweatshirt focused relationship to book community. Like that's actually great because I have many other communities with like a lot of depth, a lot of friction, a lot of nuance. And I love that. If all my communities were operating at sweatshirt level, which is now what I'm calling it. If that was all I had, if all I had was a closet full of sweatshirts that signaled what communities I belong to, I think I would feel very lonely and very dissatisfied with quote unquote community because it was all the same texture. Even if it had different flavors like TV show, books, I like this type of food. Like it's all kind of the same in a certain way. What this is also bringing up for me is when I first read Big Friendship by Anne Friedman and Aminatou Sow, what I really took away from that book is that we often form friendships through our similarity to other people, but we deepen them through our differences and through navigating how complex we each are, through going through conflict together, through understanding all the ways we're not the same. And I think community is very similar. I think that fandoms and affinity-based communities like run clubs you're talking about, they're only on the level of our sameness. We like this thing. They don't get at all the ways we're different about it, including some, in many instances, like fundamental differences. Like you can be in a fandom with somebody who like is incredibly sexist, homophobic, transphobic, like things that I would say like undermine my right to be a human being in the world, right? We can be in the same fandom. We don't have to grapple with those differences. That's the difference of like belonging. Like to me, belonging happens when we can embrace and accept a difference as much as our shared sameness in any capacity. And of course, I like belong to different fandoms, but it doesn't feel the same. Like that could go away at any moment. But I want more. I guess I'll just say that I want more. I want more than sweatshirt level community. And I feel lucky that I have it. But I think a lot of people don't. And what I see happening is like when we don't have that type of community, we seek similarity. We seek the brand that makes us feel like we belong, but we mistake that for like a deeper sense of belonging that can bring together difference and similarity.
Yeah. And I like thinking about it like a very nonlinear journey too. Like for me, I know like when I first moved back here, kind of coming out of like peak pandemic, like I needed to be in like a deep affinity space with people who made me feel really safe. And I first got involved with this group called the Radical Adventure Writers in New Haven. That is a group, it's a national group, but this is a chapter locally for folks who are identify as trans, non-binary, who are women or femme. And it was just like, I was like even not that into biking. I was mainly there to just like hang out and go to the potlucks and then like sometimes bike and build new skills around that. But I like really hung out deeply in that space for like a year because that's like who I needed. And over time, I found myself just naturally kind of craving like a little bit more expansion and feeling like I had more in my tank to meet people who were like different ages than me or like, hang out more with just like in the co-op in itself. There's a hugely diverse group of people coming through that space every day. And I really care about the co-op's mission and like just knowing that like it means if I want to and I have the capacity to engage that is looking like me going beyond my like super deep affinity group and actually expanding into people to be friends with like the 75-year-old cis man mechanic who like, you know, tells me I have nice eyes. But I love him. And like, and we've developed a great relationship. I needed to kind of like, again, I also don't think it's linear. I think it's not that you have to be a part of something that is like reflects that sameness and then eventually like go out into the big bad world. Like I find myself dipping back in. And I love what you said about the texture because these things are all like maybe a bigger ecosystem of things that prepare us for different types of community. I think that it is baby steps and maybe is again another thing enforced by social media a little bit that the affinity space feels like the main thing we should want and most closely mirrors maybe our experience on social media as well, like just being in the bubble and then being able to experience a bubble with other people. Again, not a bad thing, quite often like a literal matter of safety, but it is worth again looking for if you are noticing that your social experience is not really reflecting like the kind of like greater picture that you want to have, the kind of relationships you want to build, like it could be why. And maybe you don't have the capacity to grow bigger than that. But I think it's worth knowing, as you're saying, that there's lots of different ways like this kind of community can actually present in your life too.
I really love this. I feel like I just want to underline your point that building community around affinity or around identity can be incredibly important and help us feel like safe to explore the world, which I think is important. And I think takes a lot of people to social media when we feel like we can't find reflections of ourselves in the world around us and we don't feel safe there in our immediately local community. We often go to social media to find people who look like us, talk like us, feel like us, move through the world like us. And I think that has been like a beautiful benefit of social media, right? So many people have been able to dream beyond the confines of their immediate existence by seeing these images online. And I've had my own experiences of that as well. And also, I think that at this stage of what social media is, the types of interactions it offers, and the way the algorithms on various platforms works, it really limits the texture of communities we can have online. And I was thinking too with what you said before, like on social media, if there is rupture, there's no way to repair in the social media space. If somebody posts something you don't like, you can block them. That's not repair. You can blow up their comments. That's not repair. You can like, I guess, go into their DMs and try to like talk it out. But in my approach to conflict resolution, that's not really going to get us toward repair either. And that's something I think about a lot with like kind of deepening community is this sort of like relationship to conflict, this embrace of friction. And I'm not saying like go seek out people who undermine your fundamental right to exist. But I am saying, like, when we may have a misunderstanding with somebody we are in meaningful relationship with, or when somebody says something we're like, oh, that landed wrong for me, or they do something where we're like, that doesn't align with how I've seen you behave before, who I know you to be. Like, the skills we need to navigate all of that, I have never seen presented or like masterfully executed, or even just like semi well executed on social media itself. So there's a lot of both and here. And as we've said for this entire conversation, like, we're not here to critique or demean people who are seeking these things on social media, but perhaps to invite all of us to consider how social media may be impacting our expectations for or experiences of both our identity and our communities, and to consider stepping into relationship in different ways. So I wanted to end us with having you share a resource that you've created, which is the Group Hug Community Starter page, how to get started on getting started with your community practice. I know that you think a lot as a creative person and artist of like people as a medium and how to create these spaces. You've already alluded to this, how to facilitate, how to hold space, how to invite in, how to host, and all of that. So I'm curious if you could just kind of share with us what you recommend on this community starter page. We'll link it in the show notes so people can find it. But for anyone who's listening to this, who's like, all right, Elise and Amelia, I hear you. I need more community, different community, textured community. I'm only on the sweatshirt level and I would like to go elsewhere. What are your starting points for folks who might be feeling that way?
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing I'll say again is like, I feel like my peers are artists and organizers, and that's kind of who I am looking to. And in this way, I actually feel like while we maybe are focusing on Instagram and social media as a block around community or connection, it's also actually like a block for so many other life shifts that we want to be making in our lives. And I'm starting here because in this way, I actually find almost like analogous spaces to this experience, like in, for example, creativity and art making, right? It can be very easy to be like, I'm going to be on social media to look for the inspiration that I need to make my art. I'm going to buy endless books always, but I'm not actually going to like put paintbrush to paper or like start writing like I need to, but I'm just going to kind of end in this constantly consumptive cycle of looking at other people doing this thing that I want to do. Same thing with like, even, looking at like mental health and being like, I feel the need to be on Instagram all the time to like look at more mental health infographics and posts. And like, maybe this is really helpful, but maybe I'm not actually taking the steps in my own life to like take care of my mental well-being. So I really, again, feel like this isn't just about getting started with community or organizing. It is actually like a much broader conversation about how it is hard to make meaningful lifestyle shifts when you're in a space of constant consumption. And as we've been talking about, like tranceness in the social media world that is like designed to keep us just on there and not actually ever leaving to do the things we want to do. So I think when I created this resource, it was initially for that event I mentioned earlier where people co-worked together to get started on something, whether that was literally just for me, for example, I want to volunteer with this food surplus delivery service in town that redistributes groceries to folks who need it. And they required my driver's license in order for me to actually sign up as a volunteer. And it was enough of a barrier that I just wasn't making time to do it. And so I used this time with other people to do this thing. And I created this resource, the starter page, to share and kick folks off in that time if they didn't know what they wanted to be working on. And the biggest piece, like in creating this, is actually much more like maybe inspired by More Artists' Way than anything else, which is like part of this is you're elevating this to the holy, like its holy space, which is that community and connective things might be hard to slot in between other things in your life, like loading the dishwasher or like taking care of your kids or whatever. Like it might need its own dedicated time to treat almost like a practice, like anything else, like at least when you're getting it off the ground. And I've found for myself that like elevating it this way has helped me see it for what it is and give the required attention and space to actually making it happen. So some of the ideas on there are things like filling out your calendar with local events and like has a few ideas of different sources you can turn to. This was big time inspired by my friend Fatima, who there's like a local film archive here. And she's like, I really want to go to more movies with you all this year. She filled out a calendar with all the screenings and then shared it with us. It was a Google Calendar, so we could all add it to our own calendars and have it show up alongside our other daily life stuff. And it was such a powerful small tool that was not on social media, has this present in a thing that I'm looking at anyway every day, and will make a meaningful difference in how I'm showing up in person. And so the other kind of things on there, like even just writing an email to somebody that you think is cool, or like signing up for too many local email newsletters, like these have been some steps I've taken to like deprogram and reprogram myself towards different sources that I want to be spending more attention on. And over time, they like really do like scratch, I think, some of the itch that I was missing in social media, like that connection, that sense of tapped inness. Part of me thinks this list is like extremely basic. Maybe you'll open it and be like, duh, but I don't know. I think maybe even this is less about any of these steps and more about, as I was mentioning, just the philosophy of elevating community involvement to being its own thing. I think this is the thing that can help bridge that gap, that this is not something that we are like maybe inherently or intuitively amazing at right now, but we want to be. And so just like any other shift you would want to make in your own life towards living more like you want to live, like you might need to take some time and attention to actually do that. And so that's kind of the spirit behind the Get Started page.
I love it so much. And yes, some of the things are perhaps like basic, but they were all great reminders, even for me, like years into my community building practices of like, okay, yeah, these are things I'm not doing, or they're things that maybe I used to do before I was so enmeshed in social media. And then there's this way where like I feel annoyed that I have to do them again. I'm like, ugh, work. I don't want to do this work. I don't want to fill out the form. I don't want to go to the info meeting. I'm too advanced for an info meeting. Like these narratives spin in my head. And I think that when I think about community building, like, and my journey with it, a lot of it started out feeling as obligation. Like when I was growing up, our like broadest sense of community as a family was a church. And I was obliged to go to church twice a week, and I didn't like it.
Wow, twice a week.
I grew up in the South. So Wednesday night, Sunday morning, baby, we were there. But like a lot of the sort of traditional built-in structures for community, I think in many people's lives may have felt like things your parents made you do or stuff I was obligated to do. So I quit doing all of that. But I never like re-invited or re-obligated myself to do anything else. And I think that sometimes when we're trying to do something new, it can feel like an obligation. But we have to find a different relationship on ourselves. We have to work at the layer of our desire to want to do it. And we have to find that within ourselves. I just see people talk a lot about how like they don't have the time to build community. It's too much work. And I empathize with that. And also, if we want these more like radical community structures, I see the same people talking about wanting, if you want co-living, if you want cooperative businesses, like that is a lot of work, and we have to desire that work. I feel similarly about conversations around accessibility, and people talk about it like an obligation, but it has to actually be something we desire. Inclusivity is something I desire. It's not something that's put on me that I have to do. It's something I deeply want in my work. And so I align my behavior and I make shifts for that reason. And that's complicated. I don't have a 10-step plan for how anybody can like shift their desires, how you can root out what you really deeply want and need from all the layers of like algorithmic conditioning on top of it. But that, I think, is what we're talking about. We have to find that desire for community, and then we have to really also desire the things that will bring us the community, which is the work of it. And that can be beautiful. So anyway, that's my little like soapbox moment.
I'm with you. It's a great soapbox, and I agree 100% with everything you said. Like one of the first things that started in my journey around this stuff was just realizing like, yeah, again, not just the gap in what I understood was important and what I was actually doing, but the kind of person I wanted to be, and then how I was showing up, which was like often fearful, petty, flaky, and I was like, I want to be that person. In my mind, I'm a better person than that. So what does it look like for me to like actually follow through on something I signed up to do and volunteer with? What does it look like for me to like actually reach out to the like organization that I'm interested in learning more about, and not just staying in this passive state? And again, as you're saying, it takes a lot to actually move you there, but I try to kind of almost try on like all these different framings. And sometimes some of them move me on other days more than others, like based on what is motivating. So I invite, anybody to try that out, that there's, again, no wrong way to do this. And even if you're just like, I want to be alone and I don't want community, that's fine.
Yeah. You don't have to want this either. Well, Elise, how can people connect with you and learn more about your work if they are all in on what you're up to at this point?
I think for now, grouphug.substack.com is the place. Group hug, like a big hug. But this year, I'm excited to be doing a lot more stuff beyond the newsletter. So also we'll keep an eye out for more things like zines and events and toolkits that are going to be coming out to decentralize. You always got to be careful about centralizing too much on anything. So I'm trying to be nimble on this. But for now, that's the best place.
Yes, I love this. Also, I just have to tell you that because group hug is written in all caps, in my head, it has always said, group hug. I always yell it inside of me. So
whenever I'm like writing it, I'm like, do I put it in all caps to this person? Am I correcting them? Like, is that obnoxious? Yeah.
I mean, it is, but I really like it. Yelling is always obnoxious, but it's very necessary sometimes. So thank you for our big yell of a group hug. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you, listeners, for taking the time to listen with and to us. And until next time, we will see you off the grid. Thanks for listening to Off the Grid. Don't forget to grab your free Leaving Social Media toolkit at offthegrid.fun/toolkit. This podcast is a Softer Sounds production. Our music is by Melissa Caitlin Carter of Making Audio Magic, and our logo is by Natelier Studio. I'm your host, Amelia Ruby, and until next time, I'll see you off the grid and on the interweb.
Let's go off the grid. Okay. Let's go off the grid. Okay. I know that you really want to put your phone away. Yeah.